right, welcome. So today I'm interviewing Jeff Krasno, who is the founder of One Commune, the co-founder of Wanderlust, and also author of his new book, Good Stress. Welcome to the show.
Hey, so great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So I want to start by hearing a little bit about your story that led you here. So I know that you healed a chronic illness, and I want to hear a little bit about how that happened for you.
Yeah, well, the first step in really reversing my diabetes was strangely not any kind of protocol. It was actually telling myself a new story about myself. I think so many of us anchor our identities in kind of the rucksacks of these old stories.
Hmm.
And as I started to unpack my own physiology and look under the hood, what I realized is I am not a product, I'm actually a process. And change is all that is actually happening. So I am 7 octillion atoms, as you are, enjoying 37 billion chemical reactions per second. So change is really the only thing on offer. And once I woke up to that idea, I realized that I was no longer that people-pleasing kind of chubby kid that would do anything to be liked.
Mm.
And that really gave me a tremendous amount of agency over my own health. And from there, I could actually adopt tactics. But that
Mm.
first step was actually more psychological and spiritual than it was fasting or cold water therapy.
Well, that makes sense because if we don't have the belief that we can heal, then it's really hard to heal, right? So would you say that the first step was psychological and emotional, and then you began to implement the actual tactics and techniques, and some of those you share in your book?
Yeah, I think that's right, Jay. I mean, um, I think we all have to do a biopsychosocial intake form, if you will, on
Mm.
ourselves and get, really honest in that inventory about our story. I mean, I really, really felt that my fate was written in my genetic stars, if you will, that I had the thrifty gene, that was really great in a famine, but not so great on Instagram or whatever, and that I was essentially destined to be this chubby kid. And um, and then, as I learned more about physiology, it actually informed a lot of ideas that are more connected to metaphysics. This idea that is 2,500 years old that the Buddha had under the Bodhi tree around impermanence, that everything in the universe is subject to decay and construction and deconstruction. So clinging to anything or craving anything is futile, right? So that was a really interesting philosophical or psychological satori. But then when I actually started to study human physiology, the medical actually proved out the mystical. It said,
Mm.
yeah, I am impermanent. I'm not the same dude that started even this interview with you.
Mm.
And that may seem obvious to people, but I do really believe that people get stuck in this notion that they are just a product, they're just a thing,
Mm.
and they're unchangeable. So I think that this was a big awakening for me. And then, of course, like I started to study metabolism and I
Mm.
started to learn that, data actually shows that your metabolism, doesn't really alter that much between 20 and 60. So this notion that like I just had bad metabolism, like I have a sweater that's ugly, um, it's just an apocryphal myth.
Mm.
Um, and once you sort of realize that like health exists along this spectrum from wholeness to disconnection and disease, and you can be influencing the trajectory on that spectrum of healing that's moving towards wholeness or ailing that's moving towards disease and disconnection, that provides people with a tremendous amount of agency and
Mhm.
empowerment.
Beautiful. Yeah, there's so many things to unpack in there. You said something in your book about chronic ease creating chronic disease. And that really struck me because I think in our modern culture, we have this belief that creating ease and clearing our path of all obstacles is the right thing to do to eliminate stress. But you're saying the exact opposite. So, when you said you haven't seen any data that shows that the metabolism shifts much between 20 and 60, that in itself is sort of a myth that you're busting here because a lot of people that I talk to say, well, once I hit a certain age, it just became impossible to keep my weight down or it became impossible to manage this part of my health. Do you feel that those two things are related?
Yeah, I mean, in the last 150 years, but really accelerating in the last 50 years, we've really engineered our lives for a tremendous amount of convenience and comfort.
Mhm.
And we really, really think that, Jeff coming home from work, lying down on the couch, kicking his feet up in a nice temperature neutral environment controlled by this nice little digital box, on the wall, binging Netflix, ordering Chick-fil-A from DoorDash, or whatever. We really kind of peg that as the life of ease, but that's really not the life of ease we're truly looking for, candidly, because that short-term ease, while it may ephemerally address certain perceived deficiencies or discontents or feelings of boredom, etc., they might give us a little dopamine rush in the short term. All of those behaviors and all of those artifacts, I guess, of modernity, I would call them, actually upend our biology. They hijack our biology and they lead to a lot of disease. And that's my thesis, is that the majority of chronic disease is a result of chronic ease. And if you go back and really look at how Homo sapiens evolved over 200,000 years and millions of years of hominid life before that, we evolved in relationship to our environment. That's how evolution works. And that environment included a lot of Paleolithic stress that actually conferred a tremendous amount of resilience in the human body. And when we've stripped that those discomforts out of modern life, we really we really upend all of these hard wrought advantages that we have in our miraculous organisms. I mean, the always availability of shelf stable, nutrient deficient calories, right?
Mhm.
That's not a good thing, for metabolism or weight management. The never having to endure fluctuations in temperature like we used to do on the Serengeti, that undermines our metabolic health, our emotional resilience, the idea that we never really have to lift heavy things or move our bodies, that most of our lives can be conducted from behind a desk in a chair that our bodies aren't suited for, wearing sort of synthetic clothing that are stain proof and waterproof, etc. Again, all of these things may seem convenient on the surface, and many of them have been engineered in the name of profit, candidly. But they really, really upend human health, and there's just so many examples of it.
I mean, I so agree. When my husband and I, we lived in the city of Vancouver in Canada for about 7 years together. And during that time, my health was just imploding.
Mm,
I was so sick. I went through all sorts of testing, had some markers for Lyme, couldn't handle bright light, was so overstimulated all of the time. Just felt like I was being eaten alive by my environment. And then we even moved to a beautiful house that was on the outskirts of the city by the ocean, and I started to get a little bit better, but I just never really felt well.
mm,
And one day we just decided we were getting out of here and we bought 10 acres in the forest on a little island and it was like a magical switch. Within a month I was sleeping incredibly. I was waking up with the sun. I was hiking every day. I felt like a brand new person, like I
mm.
was reborn, and
Yeah.
here we have conveniences, right? We have a beautiful home, but my husband's outside working on the land every day. He's chopping wood to build fires. We're pulling up weeds. We're planting and growing and watering. And there's a lot of labor involved in living this lifestyle. And there are times where I'm like, what are we doing? This is so hard and so messy.
Yeah.
There's no pristine environment when you live in the woods on the West Coast. And so I've felt that, but it's just been remarkable to feel the difference in my nervous system, in my health, to go from somebody who could hardly even handle really a conversation some days because I was so fatigued to just being vibrant. It really does make a
Mm.
difference what you say.
Yeah, that's amazing, Shay. I mean, really what you're doing is you're living in greater alignment with your own biology, with your own
Mhm.
engineering, right?
Yeah,
And, we're not going to mimic every aspect of Paleolithic life, right?
let's hope
Um,
not.
there are some innovations that have served us well. Certainly, I don't want to deal with life without fire or the wheel, let's say.
Right.
Um, but as human beings, we tend to take things too far. The innovation of the light bulb, something simple as that, came along with quotes like, "Well, we'll sleep when we die."
Yeah,
Now we have artificial light.
yeah.
Will make us more productive so we can produce and grow more. And we like
Mhm.
sanctified and celebrated growth at every turn, right? Often at the expense of repair and restoration. So, you know, I think we really need to look more closely at the world that we've created for ourselves and, make hard decisions like the one you made. And it's like, I think, if you ask everyone to reflect on some of the hardest things that they've had to go through in their lives and what's on the other side of those hard things.
Mhm.
And, that can be a very profound excavation for a lot of people. And it also can be a very, very simple one. I mean, likely when you were in Vancouver, you bought an ethylene gassed tomato at a supermarket. Maybe you
Mhm.
didn't, but maybe you've tasted one before. It
Mhm.
tastes like cardboard and water, right? But you probably also have had the great fortune to taste one that you've grown in your backyard. And
Yeah.
as you say, that doesn't come without some degree of inconvenience. Like you have to cultivate the soil, you have to plant the seed, you have to tend it, you have to prune the leaves properly. You actually have to educate yourself. It's a little bit uncomfortable, but what happens when you bite into that tomato, right?
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
sweet and luscious and fecund and juicy. It's marvelous.
Mhm.
But that is the true ease, candidly, that we're seeking. But it doesn't come without a little bit of inconvenience. And that is really analogous to so many other aspects of life. We know that when we stress a biceps muscle, we know that we cause a little bit of insult to it. There's an inflammatory response, right, to that insult. But then the body miraculously summons these structural proteins, myosin and actin, and we give that muscle enough rest and we eat enough good lean protein, right? And what happens? That muscle grows back stronger, and this very basic analogy or this very basic example, I should say, of like muscle hypertrophy can really be applied to so many areas of your life.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, beautiful. It's really sparking this remembrance in me because I see so much of what you're saying reflected in the world where we are so used to making things comfortable for ourselves that we don't realize that we're actually sabotaging our own health, our own wellness, our own connection. And even in the last year, for this first Christmas with my daughter, well, wasn't her first Christmas, but it was the first Christmas where she could really get her hands into things with me. And
Hmm.
I didn't buy any presents. I crafted every single present. I spent months, like our house was chaotic because I grew everything, all of the medicines, harvested it, processed it, turned it into medicines, processed it into gifts, made vanilla bean, all of the things, and just spent hours and hours candle making. And it felt so ancestral. And there
Mm.
is really something to be said for just reconnecting to that ancestral blueprint of working with our hands and using our ancestral skills. Even cooking for ourselves is an ancestral skill, right? And these are things, like you said, that we have really forgotten. Uh, So I love that your book is so focused on that for people to reclaim that.
Yeah, that's a beautiful observation. I mean, modernity tends to commodify everything, and then once it does, it seeks out the greatest possible efficiencies and lowest costs into replicating that commodity, right? And so that's why fast fashion exists, right? Where we're just absolutely happy to throw away a t-shirt that we've worn 2 or 3 times. But would you ever throw away that heirloom sweater or dress that your grandmother knit or made from hand? Never, never. Those are the most precious things. So the gifts that you're making for Christmas, those are truly treasures. They're truly actually meaningful because they're not replicable. They're not commodified. They're actually expressions of something much, much deeper. And I think that that is the sacred form of economics, if you will. But I think that's the kind of more sacredness that we're looking for so desperately in a world that seems devoid of soulfulness. So I'm
I would
happy
agree.
for that. I'm happy that what you're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with everything that you're saying about that. And you were touching a little bit on the light bulb, so I want to kind of double click on that. Something
Sure.
that we have red lights all over our home, and when the sun goes down, it's red light only or fire. Uh, I'm very sensitive to light. Like if I'm in fluorescent lighting, I feel as though I might pass away. It's just so torturous for me. I cannot understand when I go into a store in another country and all these people are working under fluorescent lights. I just feel horrible because it's so bad for us. And I think we don't realize what the impact of that is. And in your book, you say that light is medicine. So can you unpack that a little bit?
I'd love to. Yeah, I'll try to do it without getting too geeky, but that's my
I mean, I
instinct.
love the geeky part.
So of course, we evolved in relationship to being immersed in nature. We slept either outside or in very rudimentary homes. And, we woke with the sun. And in that early morning period, there is a strand of the electromagnetic wave spectrum that we know as blue light, right? So this is around 480 nanometers for the geekier folks among us. And in relationship to that light, we actually develop these really special sensory neurons in our retina, sort of in the inferior lower part of the retina, that would receive that certain light. And that light would actually set what is known as our circadian rhythm. So circa means approximately, dia means a day. So approximately a day we would have an internal time clock that would be set by that blue light. And those little intrinsically sensitive neural ganglion cells or whatever, they would send a little signal to these nodes called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that sends a little signal to the pineal gland to produce this counter-regulatory hormone known as melatonin. So melatonin is on a teeter-totter with cortisol. So cortisol is actually, we tend to demonize it in modern society because we have too much of it, but it's actually a very useful hormone. It gets Shay and me out of bed to do this podcast. It makes us alert. Um, but, it's when we have too much yang, when we have too much cortisol, we get into states of imbalance. But this subject to light at the right time of day is medicine insofar that it essentially sets the clock to release melatonin at a certain time of day, and then that helps us get foundational sleep. And we know how important sleep is to health in so many different ways. Um, so it's really, and then you talk about amber light in the evening. And again, if you really ask yourself the question, which is what I really recommend everyone do when they try to answer inquiries around health, is how did I evolve? Well, we evolved hanging out at night in groups of, 60 to 80 around amber light, a fire, right? And that fire existed in the inferior field. and didn't actually interrupt this kind of hormone setting mechanism that we have naturally in our body. And that's why it's so important at night, if you're going to have lights on, that they're in the amber, they're more towards the infrared side of the spectrum, and that they're in the inferior part of or inferior field. So they're down at foot level, or below eye level, etc. And so these, again, it's amazing and fun to kind of unpack, why some of these, components of sleep architecture and sleep hygiene exist, because really what they do is they align with how we evolved.
Yeah. Well, and even in the waking daylight, fluorescent lighting just can't be good for us. And I did
No.
hear something about fluorescent lighting shutting off melatonin production completely and really impacting our hormones, which is why I said I just feel really bad. Like feel that it's not if it should be like a human rights violation to force people to be working for 8 hours under lights that are interrupting their hormones. And we have them in hospitals and all over the place. And to me, that just doesn't seem right. Do you think that that's the case, that it really is that harmful?
Yeah, well, old school, LEDs were primarily in the blue field, and so they're very cold, right? They do, but we instituted them because they were a lot more energy efficient. So there was some actual, like, legitimately decent intention in doing that. But, at that juncture, I don't think we had the realization that they were essentially endocrine disruptors.
Right.
So now there are a new developed LED light that is more in the amber field. And so I always recommend people experiment with that. Obviously, like the old school incandescent lights, do emit like the warmest light, and more towards the amber side. So, you know, I I think those are great, and I also understand, the argument around energy conservation. So, this is a place where innovation actually might serve our interests if we do it intelligently, is to actually create energy efficient lights that are in the amber field, that don't disrupt melatonin production.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, the piece around fire is really for just to people who are listening to have a bit of a case study. When we go to Mexico in the wintertime, my daughter sleeps like a dream. Like she just puts herself to bed at 7 p.m., sleeps through the night, doesn't wake up till 8 in the morning. She's 2.5. And when we come home, we live on the West Coast in an island, like really tucked into the forest. It's quite gray in the winter here, completely different human. She barely sleeps. She stays up until 11 or midnight, wakes up a whole bunch throughout the night. But one thing that I've found that really does work is we have a forest in our backyard with a big fire pit. And so we'll just go
Mm,
out there with the PJs and the sleep sack on, and we'll just sit around the fire and sing and talk. And she'll fall asleep in my arms to the fire, no problem. And then I can just carry her into bed and we all go to sleep. And I find I have the best sleeps too when we're fire gazing.
mm,
And it's just so interesting how you have, on one hand, the fire, which is the original form of television, really. That's we all used to sit around and tell stories. And that was how we connected. That's how we entertained ourselves, which is really good for us. And we've replaced it with these phones and devices that emit the blue light that turn off our hormone production. And instead of sitting around a fire together at night or having candles lit, we're now alone, or even we're with our partners, but we're not even facing each other and we're on our devices right before bed. And
mm.
you talk a lot about the difference between good stress and bad stress in your book. And I think that that's a pretty clear illustration of it too. It's just how far we've come from what's ancestrally normal for us to replicating these things that are actually killing us.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And we tend to have a very negative association with stress, and you know, justifiably,
Mhm.
because modern stress tends to be chronic and in the wrong dosage, right?
Right.
And when you have chronic stress in the wrong dosage, that will lead to the imbalances that then we label as disease. So almost all diseases are reflections of some form of imbalance, right? Lipid imbalance or neurotransmitter imbalance or blood sugar imbalance, etc. So, but good stress, the stress that we evolved with, generally tends to be short term, acute. It just comes and goes. And that's actually incredibly adaptive. That actually confers a lot of resilience. It activates all of these longevity pathways. So for example, we evolved with a good amount of calorie scarcity, right? Um, and it was totally normal. In fact, it was adaptive to become a little bit chubby, a little bit fat in the late summer or early fall. Your loincloth might get a little tighter on the middle, but no one was there to, judge you on the gram or anything. It was, but that was adaptive because, winter's fallow was right around the corner, and there would be this paucity of calories that not only kept us lean and, maintained good muscle mass, but it also ends up, as we've discovered now, activating all of these resilience pathways. You know, a little bit of calorie deprivation actually grows new mitochondria. It stimulates the production of this protein called brain-derived neurotrophic factor that maintains neural function and even grows new neurons, even later in life. It contributes to metabolic flexibility, where we can actually burn fat and glucose pretty seamlessly for energy. It stimulates ketosis. It activates this process called autophagy, where we break down kind of these senescent zombie dysfunctional proteins into their component building blocks. So this is a really, great example of, where a little bit of discomfort in the form of hunger, a little bit of, calorie scarcity at the right times in the right doses actually confers a benefit. Now, of
Mhm.
course, you don't want the wrong dosage and you don't want it to be chronic, because chronic hunger in the wrong dosage leads to starvation and malnutrition. Of course, that's not good. Hypoxia can lead to death, right? But a certain amount of like breath work and breath holding, right, actually activates a benefit. You actually grow more red blood cells in reaction to like actually holding your breath for a little while, making yourself a tiny bit uncomfortable, right? Getting into a cold plunge stimulates the production of dopamine over a long protracted period of time, but you don't also want hypothermia, right? So, this is why I really recommend that people just lean into the very edge of their discomfort, just the edge, on a daily basis. I would never tell a runner to go run a marathon if they've never run a 5K, or I'd never say, hey, jump into your first ice plunge at 34 degrees. That would not be smart. But again, this is the things that we tend to avoid in life. Even stressful conversations, we avoid those, because they make us uncomfortable, right? And so instead, we send texts or we hide as kind of anonymous digital warriors, right, behind keyboards. But again, look at how we evolved. We evolved in tribes of 60 or 80 or 100. It didn't mean that we didn't have conflict. Of course we did. Of course we had conflict. But you and I would have had to sit down face to face, and next to the fire, let's say, and talk it through and be a little bit uncomfortable, but then find areas of compromise and cooperation. And, again, this is a place where we have really engineered our modern life for lack of cooperation, a lack of common ground. And you look around the political invective, and that's on full display, right?
Yes, absolutely. We're moving further and further away from our capacity to be with discomfort. And I mean, in my work in the emotional realms, that's something that I work with people on a lot, is widening our tolerance window, just to be with ourselves. And I
Mm,
love that your whole book is really about widening our tolerance for good stress, really bringing back those ways of being that are so deeply encoded in us as human beings. So if you had one message from your book that you had to stand behind as the core message, what would it be?
yeah. I think that what I really want people to take away is that change is not only possible in your life, it's really all that is available.
Mm,
And I know that that's where we started, but I feel that that's an appropriate place to end because I think so many people feel a deep sense of perceived deficiency and discontent and lack of self-love. But upward spirals in your life are on offer. Health
mm,
doesn't have to be a downward spiral. We often associate it that way, but upward spirals are available to you, and it doesn't take long for the body to begin to heal itself. And that momentum can be so delicious and adaptively addictive.
mm.
So change is possible, and upward spirals await for you around the corner.
Beautiful. That's a wonderful way to end it. And I thank you for your time today. And for everybody listening, you can get Jeff's book, Good Stress. Where is it going to be available?
I scooped up goodstress.com, and so if you want to, if you're inclined to support me directly, buy it there. And I get, when you do, I get to bundle in all of these courses from Commune, from some of my heroes, Dr. Mark Hyman, Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Zach Bush. So there's a lot of value in there. So yeah, go to goodstress.com, and I'm just very grateful to be with you and for this opportunity to connect with the just incredible community that you've created and the amazing life that you've created for yourself.
Thanks, Jeff. Really appreciated your time today. And I'm looking forward to sharing your book far and wide. I really enjoyed geeking out with you for this half an hour.
Thanks. Me too.